I heard a story recently about a man. When he was a boy, he did really well in school. His report cards had almost all A's every year. And he would bring the report cards home proudly, and his mom would say, "That's good, but you can do better." All through school, elementary school, high school, same story. He was successful. He went to a top-notch university, and he still did well. And he would tell his mom about how well he had done. And she would say, "That's good, but you can do better." And he did well, and he went to law school. He became a lawyer. Still, his mother reminded him about how much more he could yet attain. Now, he wasn't just a bright young man, he was a good athlete. He excelled in sports. He would make an achievement, and he would be told, "That's good, but you can do a little better." Well, he continued to excel. He was a successful high school athlete and won an athletic scholarship to an American college. Still, his mother would say, "That's good, but you can do better." Now, probably she meant you can do better as an encouragement. But what he heard was, "You never do well enough." I suspect that there are those of us here who have been told we can do better. Or in fact, you never do quite well enough. Judy read for us so well a moment ago from the book of Acts, chapter 9. And the story we heard has a wonderful message. No matter what, God can use you. In the mid-1st century in Jerusalem, there was a young Jewish leader named Saul. Saul was a Pharisee and had some level of authority within the governance of that society. And in the early days of the Christian movement, Saul, whom we know most commonly as Paul the Apostle, Saul was involved in the fierce persecution of the followers of Jesus as they formed into a community following Easter and became what we now know of as the early church. Saul was involved in the decision to stone Stephen, who was a follower of Jesus, who was sentenced to death by stoning for publicly preaching the good news of Jesus' resurrection. Saul was involved in trying to round up the other Christians and have them put in prison. And Saul was so successful in his persecution of the Christians in Jerusalem that he decided to go and open up a branch of that persecution in Damascus. And so we got all the relevant letters of reference and of warrant, and he was on his way to Damascus to carry on the same reign of terror. Then, as we heard, something remarkable happened to him on the road to Damascus. There was some kind of bright light, some type of heavenly manifestation, and the risen Christ spoke to Saul and convicted him of the wrong that he had been doing, not only to the followers of Jesus, but therefore to Jesus himself. And Saul fell to the ground dumbstruck. And he couldn't see. He couldn't see for 3 more days, in fact. His friends had to almost carry him the rest of the way to Damascus. And as the story later goes on to tell us, all of this was because Saul, or Paul, was to have an incredibly important part in God's plan for spreading the good news of Jesus around the world. Paul was the one to take that message beyond the Jewish community of Palestine, but to all the nations. And the lesson for us is that no matter who you are, or no matter who you think you are, God can use you. We often have a low view of ourselves and what we could or might do, even with the help of God. We may even have some level of self-loathing. But our picture of things, our understanding is clearer and more full if we hear the message of the story. No matter who you are, God can use you. I'm reminded, of course, of the story of John Newton, author of the hymn Amazing Grace, which we'll sing in just a few minutes' time. Probably many of you know the story of John Newton. In the 18th century, that is the 1700s, he was a sailor in what we might call the equivalent of the merchant marine. And he was, in fact, a slave trader. He was involved in the transportation by sea of slaves, dark-skinned slaves from Africa. Of course, this is a wicked thing to be a part of. And in fact, Newton would say later on in his life that he was such a low life that the other slave traders, the other sailors, couldn't stand him. He was a rough and tough environment, but he was the worst. He was the lowest of the low. And then became a Christian, eventually a minister in the Church of England. And he wrote the words which we will sing and people still love to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Here was the lowest of the low. And he wrote those words which are still being sung today to give praise to God. He wrote more than one hymn, and in fact, another one of his hymns is my favorite hymn. Glorious things of thee are spoken. Beautiful, wonderful words by which we might give praise to God. There's a well-known minister in England, and he tells a story, not a true story, but something to imagine. He has 3 sons. And he says, imagine my wife and I were to take our 3 sons on a picnic. And we wanted to have our picnic in the woods. And so we parked the car and take out the picnic basket and our blanket to sit on, and we decide to set off into the woods and find a nice spot for our picnic. And we wander through the woods for some time until we come to the clearing, which will be just the perfect spot for our picnic. We put down the blanket, we set down the basket, we start to pull out the food, and we realize we have 2 of the 3 sons. Do we say 2 out of 3 ain't bad? No, we stop what we're doing immediately, and we will look for that third son until we find him alive or dead. This is how God searches out for each one of us. God will search and search and search until we are found. There's a techno song that I really like by this Italian DJ, and I'm quite sure it's never been quoted in a sermon before. But in part of the song it says, "I just don't care what you've done in your life. I'll always be here by your side." These words could be spoken of God to every believer. There's another very interesting character in the story from Acts chapter 9. His name is Ananias. He was a Christian who was living in the city of Damascus. And he was minding his own business when God called out to him. God said, "Ananias, I'd like you to go to this particular street, and in fact to this particular house, and go inside, and there you will find a man named Saul." And I said, "Lord, I don't know if that's such a good idea. Have you not heard about this man Saul and what he's been doing? He's been throwing the Christians in jail, threatening to have us killed." Nonetheless, Ananias went. He knocked on the door. The door was opened. Would have explained why he was there and whom he was looking for. And he went and he found Saul in that house. Saul still without his vision. Saul probably sitting in a chair or lying down in some state of shock. And Ananias said to him, "Brother Saul, God has sent me to you that I might put my hands upon you, that you might be filled with the Holy Spirit." What a remarkable thing Ananias did. And there's a lesson for this as well. No matter who you think someone else is, God can use them. You see, one of our problems sometimes is we have a low esteem of ourselves. Sometimes we even suffer from self-loathing. At other times, sometimes we are self-righteous. We look down on someone else and think there is no good in that person, no use for them. But the implication of our story is very clear. No matter who you think someone else is, God can use that person. A wonderful book on my shelf by a psychologist called Robert Epstein. And basically it's a book about age discrimination and how we as a society look down on the young and think that the young are not able to do much. Certainly not able to do nearly as much as those who are older. And he shows through various research that this is false. There are young people who can do amazing things that we would never expect. For example, he cited the case of some high school students. Now, these are gifted students, but nonetheless high school students, teenagers who had been connected to an experimental program at a local university, and after a few months of being enrolled in this program, they were doing literally world-class research on the effect of smoking on the lungs. You never look at some teenagers and expect them to do world-class research, but here they were doing it. Some of you have likely heard of the Canadian golfer Mo Norman. He's from Kitchener, just a few minutes down the road from where I come from in Cambridge or Galt. Mo Norman had a disability. He was autistic. It affected his life in many ways. Yet Mo Norman is considered by most experts, including the likes of Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus, to be the greatest striker of the golf ball in history. You would never expect Mo Norman to have seen him, to have been able to achieve a level of athletic excellence unparalleled in history, would you? That's exactly what he did. One of my previous congregations where I served as minister was very small. Sometimes only 15 on a Sunday, maybe sometimes only 5. And the musical leader of that congregation was a woman in her early 60s. She had had little education and worked in a rather modest job. And at some point in her middle age, she had had a stroke. And she had rather limited use of the left-hand side of her body. Now, she could, of course, walk and function in a basic way, but was rather more limited than most of us. And in fact, when she played the piano, she could only hold her hand in rather a limp way, her left hand, and in fact could play with only one finger. And so she would sort of dangle her middle finger, being the longest, and drop that finger on one key at a time. And so she played the melody with her right hand and one note at a time with her left. And I tell you, the music she made was so beautiful. No one has ever glorified God through music more than this woman did. We're so inclined, I think, to judge people by criteria that simply do not matter. We may judge someone based on where they've come from, or how old they are, or how they dress, or what we perceive of their character or abilities. Now, sometimes we need to be discerning about folks and how we interact with them. But at the end of the day, most of these external things by which we judge others do not matter at all. See, the way we are taught by our society to look at people is not the way that God looks at them. Some of us have been taught that we can do better, and therefore that we have never done quite well enough. Now, if that is true for us, we may have excelled in life. We have worked hard for approval, but we have yet to attain the perfection after which we strive. The bad news, perhaps, is that we will never attain perfection. The good news is that the Bible teaches that God does not wait for us to become perfect in order to use us. Ever. We are used to asking ourselves the question, what can we do? We ought rather to think of that question as, what can God do? Or perhaps, what can God do through us? We are perhaps used to asking the question, who are we? We might instead ask, who is God? Who does God call us to be? Who does God say that we are? God can do amazing things through each one of us. Even more than this, God wants to. Will you let him?